Welcome back to the Workgrid, folks. This episode is quite a treat. Today, we're going to delve into one of the most pressing issues of our modern digital lives: the challenge of maintaining focus and attention in an age dominated by digital distractions. I'm joined by a luminary in the field of workplace psychology and digital wellness, Dr. Gloria Mark, author of the recent landmark book, Attention Span, a groundbreaking way to restore balance, happiness, and productivity. Dr. Mark's extensive research sheds light on the intricate dance between technology and our cognitive functions, offering profound insights on how our digital interactions shape our ability to concentrate, make decisions, and ultimately find satisfaction in our work and lives. Today, we'll explore the concept of attention in the workplace, unraveling the complexities of focus and executive function. Dr. Mark will guide us through the psychological frameworks that underpin our daily interactions with technology and share innovative strategies for reframing our relationship with digital tools. We'll also delve into practical techniques that promise to enhance productivity, well being, and happiness, drawing upon the rich tapestry of research and real world applications presented by Dr. Mark's book. Join us as we embark on a journey to reclaim our attention, reshape our technological relationship with tech, and maybe rediscover the balance that lies at the heart of fulfilling life and career. Stay tuned. Gloria, thank you so much for coming on to the show today. Your book, Attention Span, a groundbreaking way to restore balance, happiness, and productivity, was released just a year ago. And I have to say, gushing here a little bit. I'm an incredible fan of your work. This was a fantastic read, certainly eye-opening, and I think our audience would truly enjoy it. But for those who may be unfamiliar with your work, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the work you've been doing over the last few years?
Yeah, so I'm trained as a psychologist, but for decades I've worked in an area that's called human-computer interaction. So I apply psychological approaches and theories to try to understand how people use tech in their real lives. Now, psychologists typically bring people into a laboratory, they set up conditions and experiments, and I prefer to create what I call living laboratories where I go to where people are. So I think it's so important to understand how people use tech in their real world environments. Most of the studies I've done have been in the workplace. So looking at how people use their computers, various applications, electronic communications, smartphones, and all that. And I use a lot of different sensors. So, rather than have people self-report, because people are just notoriously bad at reporting how much time they spend on email or uh, productivity software, we actually use sensors. So we do computer logging, of course, with people's consent. They're aware of this. We use sensors to measure stress, heart rate monitors. So we get a measure of heart rate variability. And we've used lightweight cameras that people wear around their necks to be able to measure face-to-face interaction. And we also use a technique called experience sampling, where people report subjective impressions about what they're doing right now. They hit send, we get a timestamp. All of this data is synced together in time. So we have a pretty comprehensive picture of what people are experiencing when they're using their tech.
That's incredible. That methodology has must have changed quite a bit over the last 20, 25 years that you've been working in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very primitive when we started out 20 years ago. We would follow people with stopwatches. And, because that was at the time the most accurate way to capture how long people's attention was on a screen. And since then, there's been computer logging software, heart rate monitors have been, continually improved. And so, yeah, we've used wrist wearables. So we use the full gamut. But yes, it's improved a lot.
That's fascinating. And since you've been tracking attention over, well over 2 decades, some of your research, can set off some alarm bells. There was one statistic I read that, the average attention span is a mere 47 seconds or less before we end up context switching.
Yeah.
How did we get there?
How did we get there? Well, uh, 20 years ago, we found, using the stopwatches, we found people average 2.5 minutes on a screen. But let's look at what happened in those last 20 years, right? With tech, the smartphone came out in 2007. Facebook was launched in 2003, and then it just really took off. We've got Twitter. Oh, TikTok is a really big drain on attention. E-commerce just exploded, and then so many different services, medical services, government services, require people to do things online. So there's just, an increase in the integration of tech in people's lives. And, this created new kinds of habits that, for using tech. And, Slack came out, email is, a big drain on attention. So many things changed in 20 years.
In that fragmentation, so the additional paths that are being created and behaviors that are being created, it sounds like it's beginning to create patterns in individuals to pull them away, distract them, if you will. Is that a good way to kind of summarize it? How might we capture that?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, people, first of all, people are in some kind of screen on average about 10 hours a day. That's
Mm,
what the
wow.
data shows. It's not just computers and phones, but also, watching TV and films. So people have developed certain habits in conjunction with being on screens. And, it's hard to pull away for a lot of people. And then, of course, there are habits in dealing with electronic communications, email, Slack, texting, all of these things. A lot of workplaces have their own communications. And we're social beings, right? We can't help but respond to other people. And in a workplace, we're dealing with what's called social capital. You don't want to ignore someone's message because then you're losing social capital. So
Yeah.
we have to be on top of things. We want to respond to them because we want them to respond to our messages. We want to look good in front of our colleagues and our managers. So we need to be on top of all these messages. And as a result, the messages proliferate, right? And it's a lot easier to delegate work through email as opposed to walking into someone's office face to face and giving them a task. And we found that as well in our research. So, yeah, let me just throw in another really interesting statistic that, people had uh, monitored how long people were at their desk. And this went back even to the 1960s and
Mm.
70s. And they found like in that era, people would spend about 30% of their day at their desk. The other times they would be in meetings or, maybe being at the water cooler, but, probably mostly at meetings. And then in more recently, we found that this went way down. And in fact, in a study we did right before the pandemic, we found that people spend 90% of their day at their desks. And these were information workers. We tracked 750 people across the US for a year, an entire year, 90% of their day at their desks. How to account for the difference? And I would say it's because a lot of the work that had formerly been done face to face is now being done at the desktop. through email, through Zoom, through other kinds of desktop conferencing. So, we've transferred face-to-face interaction into um, into applications where people are interacting with information and each other in a digital way.
And has that created any form of a benefit, though? We oftentimes hear about that productivity paradox in the fact that, look, we have all this new technology, we have these new ways of working, and yet productivity hasn't necessarily nudged. So, by adding in the workflows, the tasks, the applications to kind of store those interactions that would have happened at a human to human level, have we created more of a problem and actually started to separate ourselves from what's truly humane in the way we work?
Yeah, I mean, like most things, it's really a double-edged sword
Hmm.
because, on the one hand, it's a huge benefit to be able to do things digitally. I mean, I don't want to go back to, paper in writing things when I can write things with a word processor on my computer. And, I'd so much rather send out a quick email if I need information than having to pick up a phone and call someone or walk over to someone. But the downside is that it has been a drain on our attention. And, our minds are a bottleneck for being able to process all this information. It's
Hmm.
not just written information, but it's also communications, right? And, the scope of work has also expanded. So people are taking on more projects, they're juggling more things because we can. We have tools that have given us the capability to do these things, right? But it's not carefully considered that the human mind is still a bottleneck to
Hmm.
be able to handle all this information. We're still not superhuman, right? Maybe at some point we'll have chips implanted in us and we can become superhuman with processing information, but that's going to be a long time before we get there.
I've heard the analogy that attention's like sipping through a straw or looking through a telescope, that we kind of will put horse blinders on ourselves, if you will, unless we get overwhelmed with stimuli that might distract us. Is that a good analogy, or is there a better analogy we should be thinking about, particularly in the workplace, in where our attention falls and how it gets shaken?
Yeah, I like to use the analogy of a flashlight, and this comes from Don Norman, if you're familiar with his work in HCI. The idea of a flashlight is you can have a very narrow beam, and you can zero in on something like you talked about. And this is when people can be really concentrated and focused on one thing. But we can also be flexible with this flashlight and we can widen the beam and we can expand it and become aware of what's in our environment, what's on the periphery.
Hmm.
Now, there's trade-off for both of these things. When we're really focused, right? We're not aware of what's going on in the environment. When we have this broad beam of this flashlight, we can become susceptible to distractions. But at the other hand, we become more aware of what's going on in our environment. And sometimes that can provide us with valuable information. For example, some years ago, I did a study at the Jet Propulsion Lab, which is part of NASA, and I studied people working in a large shared meeting space. They were designing space missions. For these people, it was really important for them at times to be super focused. Other times they expanded their this beam in their flashlight of attention so that they could hear what other people were talking about that might be relevant for their design. So these people were just really skilled at being flexible in how they use their attention. And as a result, they were able to design a space mission in 9 hours
Oh, wow.
with this, being in the same room and monitoring the environment, knowing when to be concentrated. It was really phenomenal and very successful.
Now, was that a happy accident to the personas that they had hired for the role, meaning they had the right people who were able to kind of naturally expand that out, or were they seeking the persona?
They were seeking a persona because not everyone can work in that kind of environment. It really takes a special kind of personality. Some people could get burned out, right? It's a very intensive kind of environment. Now, in the normal workplace, people aren't always in these kinds of shared spaces. You
Mm.
might share an office with someone. But nevertheless, people can also get burned out, especially if they're inundated with all kinds of information coming at them through their devices. So, and of course, a workplace can't always just seek out a certain kind of personality to be able to handle this kind of information. Everybody needs to be able to do that.
That's excellent. One of the things I was curious about is if our attention is broken repeatedly over and over again, what begins to happen to if we're not giving employees that downtime, or if we're not giving that time for them to kind of focus and get into a state of flow, it, do we end up creating that pattern for them and start eroding what we ultimately want? People working in places and doing work that's fulfilling and feels worthwhile.
Yes, that's right. So, if people just get overwhelmed, right? They get fatigued, exhausted, and this can lead to burnout. And burnout is really quite serious.
Mm.
And, just exhaustion can lead to chronic health conditions. So this is really bad for an organization. It leads to increased absenteeism. People are not so motivated to work. So it has repercussions. Now, there's a part of our minds that's called executive function.
Mm.
And when we get exhausted, this executive function can't do its job. And it does a really important job. You can think of it as the CEO of the mind, and it directs where we pay attention, the decisions we make. It helps us filter out distractions, helps us keep on track. But when it gets exhausted, it just can't do it. And we become more susceptible to distractions. And we get into a cycle. The more susceptible to distractions and dealing with distractions, the more tired we get. And then, of course, we can become on the road to exhaustion and, possibly burnout. It's not good. We find in our research consistently there's a correlation between attention shifting, shifting your attention in
Hmm.
different contexts, and stress as measured by heart rate monitors. So yeah, so there are repercussions.
That's fascinating. So you'll actually see the peaks and valleys and the
Yeah,
spikes where folks are switching their attention and to their biometrics that are feeding you that data.
yeah, because we can sync together all this data, right, in time, and so we
Mhm.
can actually see what people's experiences are based on what they're doing on their devices.
That's amazing. For executive function, is that something that can be, is it innate? Are you born with it? It sounds like it can obviously be eroded. Can it be trained? And I'm a parent of two children. I worry about this. Is it something you can create resiliency within?
Well, it's really interesting with kids. So executive function doesn't really mature until, kids are 10 years old
Oh,
or
wow.
even teenagers. And what we're seeing is kids being given devices, right? And they're being thrown into a digital environment with all kinds of distractions, and they don't yet have the fully mature capability to be able to control distractions. So, kids are learning habits that are just not really good. And there's research that shows that when kids were shown um, fast-paced videos. There's other studies
Hmm.
where they're, doing multitasking. And it shows that after they have that experience and then they do something else, it's harder for them to pay attention. So it shows that their executive function has been affected, probably fatigued from doing these, watching fast-paced videos, which have really fast shot changes, or being asked to switch tasks very fast.
It's funny you say that, and this is getting a little bit personal, but I have noticed that sometimes my daughter, she'll come home from school and say, I want to watch this, that, and the other. And I'll put it on and I'll notice the volume and velocity of the scene changes of there's, it's not story driven. It all appears to be dopamine spiking. I'm going to give you like 5 seconds here, 5 seconds here, 5 seconds here. And it's all clipping, clipping, clipping. And as soon as I see that, I'm like, I know that can't be good. Nope, you're not watching that. Like that's
Yes.
probably not healthy.
Yeah, that's really great that you do that. And as I write about in the book, in film and TV, shot lengths have decreased in length over the years, and now they average about 4 seconds. They used to be much longer. And, of course, people are exposed to, we watch YouTube and films um, and all kinds of videos. And so I'm not saying that this causes our
Mm.
short attention spans, but I believe that it reinforces our already short attention spans. And the film, TV directors and editors I believe that they're designing these shot lengths to conform to what they think people will
Mm.
pay attention to, right? So, they think we're going to pay attention when shot lengths change really fast, and it does create arousal. We know that. So, we've gotten into this strange kind of cycle with media, all forms of media.
We're getting it from all ends between the
Yeah.
workplace and in our personal lives. One question I wanted to discuss with you is email. It oftentimes comes up as being the bane of existence for many organizations, but it's something that we just have to really power through. And the
Yeah.
culprit, and one of the more fascinating things that you brought up within your book was the rotary action of seeing that pop up in the bottom right hand side and just immediately clicking on it, that behavior pattern will. And it's funny, I was sampling a small set of friends and colleagues, asking them, hey, when that happens, do you do that? Like, oh yeah, absolutely, I see it, and it's almost like a whack-a-mole, trying to
Yeah.
whack that notification away. Why is that the case? Why does that end up being pervasive within organizations?
Yeah. So first of all, let me say a little bit more about email.
Mm.
So our research found that people average checking emails 77 times a day,
Oh my god.
which is really quite a lot. We don't consider it. We actually did a study the previous year and found 74 times a day on average. So it's roughly the same amount. So it also turns out that people check email of their own accord. It's not just responding to that notification, but just they have an urge to check email. So people have become habituated to check email. Why do we do it? Well, I talked earlier about the idea of social capital,
Mm.
but also email has what's called randomly reinforced behavior. It promotes that in us. And what that means is that every time you check email, you're probably not going to get a good email or something interesting. And you might even get work that's delegated to you.
Yeah.
But every so often, you'll get some really fantastic email. It's, an invitation to, to do a keynote talk or to some event, or hey, you've just won this award or something really fantastic.
Yeah.
That's enough to keep people checking that email because they're seeking those rewards. And they know at some point there's going to be something good that that comes from that email. So that's, that's enough to keep people glued to their email.
That's fascinating. We're like the mice hitting the lever for the food.
Yes, yes.
Amazing. In the book, you discussed Maya Angelou describing her little mind, bringing tools and whatnot. I wanted to hear more about that from yourself, that ability to kind of decompress, occupy yourself with lightweight ways of refilling your attention. So, like it's something you can expand and contract, but refill and come back to things. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm really glad you brought that up because I also love that example. So the starting point is that people have a limited amount of cognitive resources or attentional capacity. And I like to use the metaphor of a fuel tank, right? We have this fuel tank of resources. Things we do throughout the day drain that tank, and other things we do can refill that tank. So the tank is drained when we're switching our attention every 47 seconds. It's also drained from doing email, which, that's a big factor. But we can replenish it by taking breaks or doing lightweight activities that are enjoyable. So there is this myth that we should try to focus as long as possible on our devices. And you can Google this and you can see here's how to focus for extended periods of time, how to focus nonstop for 10 hours. You see this. Um, but it's not humanly possible, just like we
Mm,
can't lift weights
yeah.
nonstop for for long periods. Our minds need a rest. We need to replenish that tank of attentional resources. So back to Maya Angelou, she talked about her big mind and her little mind. And her big mind was what she used to focus and have deep thought. And that's what she used to produce all her great work. And then every so often, she would pull back and use what she called her little mind. Her little mind was when she did crossword puzzles or other simple kinds of puzzles, very easy, engaging, lightweight things for Maya Angelou. And this helped her replenish. Now, we're not when we do these lightweight kinds of activities, our mind is still working,
Mm.
right? But it's also giving us a chance to de-stress and kind of clear our minds. It also turns out that people are happiest when they're using their so-called little minds,
Oh,
right?
interesting.
It makes people happy because it's easy, it's engaging. Whereas when people focus, there is stress involved, right? You'll be
Yeah.
very rewarded after you do this hard work. But, in the process of doing it, it's going to be, a little bit of a challenge for people. So that's why they're not as happy as when they're using little mind.
Hmm.
So the important thing, when I talk about balance, is to understand and become aware of when you're starting to feel fatigued. That's the time to pull back and let your mind replenish. You don't have to do simple puzzles. You can go out and take a walk. And in fact, the research shows that just a mere 20 minutes in nature can significantly de-stress people. Our research showed that people are more creative. They use what's called divergent thinking better. That's brainstorming, essentially.
Mm.
They come up with more ideas after just 20 minutes in nature. So there's all kinds of ways that we can pull back, allow ourselves to replenish. And it's so important to intersperse these periods of using little mind with periods of using big mind. It helps us perform better with our big minds.
Incredible. One of the things we see certainly within the the North American culture is that always on mentality. And for our audience who tends to be digital workplace leaders, CIOs, how can they begin to promote a healthier relationship with technology for their employees? The example you just gave, look, people are not going to be able to focus 100% of that to 8 hour workday in on their tasks. They need to have those breaks, time under tension. They have to have that relief. What can leaders do to begin to foster that type of better health and relationship with their work tech?
Yeah. I think they need to give people permission to take significant breaks,
Mm,
right? And I think a lot of people are under pressure, like, oh, I can't take a break, right? I have to be thinking about deadlines. Deadlines need to be more realistic, right? And also the scope of work for individuals needs to be more realistic. It's really what's being traded off is quantity and quality.
mm,
And you can do better quality work when you have, more attentional capacity to devote to it. So, we need to think about how can we promote that attentional capacity? Let's allow people time to take good breaks and restore this capacity. So I think, on a higher level, it's really about understanding that well-being should come first with employees over, pushing output, pushing productivity, because there is a theory in psychology called the broaden and build theory, which shows that when people have positive well-being, they can perform better, they can produce more, and you know, quality is better. And so, how can we get employees to have positive well-being? Motivation would increase. What's called presenteeism in the workplace would increase, which is being more involved, more
mm.
engaged in the work. So let's think about that.
Excellent. Have you seen? I know it must be super early right now in terms of attention, wellness, and management, where that elastic effect we've had. We went from being a culture that worked in an office to a few years with COVID, working from home, and now this, dare I say, kind of trial and error game of return to office on attention, stress, and wellness. Is there emergent research now in terms of what we're seeing or how employees are reacting to this change?
Yeah, there is ongoing research looking at hybrid work to
Mm,
see, and again, it's really trying to understand what's the optimal schedule for a hybrid kind of work, because um, people can benefit from having in-person social interaction with employees, right? And let me give an example. We did a study on motivation when people were working at home. And it turns out that people use a very different kind of motivation when they're working from home or working remotely compared to when they're in person. When they're in person, they see all kinds of social signals from other people that they're working, right? And it helps facilitate their own motivation
hmm
and gives them kind of energy and fuel to work. And when they're home, they lack those signals, right? So that's something to think about. What's that optimal schedule so that people can get back to the workplace, get those kinds of signals, right? To kind of empower them to be motivated so that they can, when they work at home, it can still there can be carryover effects of that motivation. And of course, when people are working at home, there's less stress from not commuting. So that's a
Yeah.
really big benefit. On the other hand, people report more loneliness as well. So, I think there's a lot of promising research in hybrid work, right? Because it can help restore these kinds of uh, needs that people have for social interaction. And yet it can also provide them with benefits of working at home. But I will say, some of the challenges are getting people on a regular schedule, because when people work at home, what we found in our research is that people tend to revert to working for those hours consistent with their chronotype.
Ah,
Chronotypes means, are you an early person or a late person? If you're an early person, you're going to start work at, 6 o'clock in the morning or whatever your peak time is. If you're a late type. You're going to slide and you're going to start work at maybe 11 o'clock when you start getting into your peak and you work, late into the night. And so what happens is that people will get inconsistent schedules. They've
Hmm.
got their physical work schedule where you're kind of mandated to be in the workplace within a certain time window, and then they're working at home and they let things slide. So that's a challenge that's going to have to be solved because, people will need to get on regular schedules if they're switching between the workplace and home.
Absolutely. And that's not something you exactly, end up hiring for or questioning for in terms
Right.
of the type. And you may not even be aware that you're someone who, you know what, I'm most productive at 9 a.m. to 11, and then I come back around 3 p.m.
Right. Right.
Excellent. One of the questions I had for you, just because it had at least risen in prominence, or a fad, I should say, is this concept of a digital detox. Is that a fad? People taking off from social media 2 weeks, whatnot, trying to minimize that screen time, creating healthy digital habits with themselves, or are we just lying to ourselves?
Well, I see digital detoxes in the same way I see crash diets. So when you're on a crash diet, you're losing weight, and then you come back and you just go back to your old eating habits.
Sure.
And so what's more important is you change your way of life. And you don't need a digital detox to do that. So, the ship has sailed. We live in a digital world. We can't get away from digital media. But what we need to do is to develop a better relationship with media, a healthier
Mm,
relationship with digital tech. And so and we can do that without a digital detox, right? And in fact, maybe digital detoxes make it worse because, people are deprived of a number of things, and then they go back and they revert back into their old habits. So it's really about changing habits, right? Not just pulling away and then coming back, but really changing habits and understanding that we can improve our positive well-being when we've developed these new habits. And it's also about gaining what I call meta awareness, which is an awareness of what we're doing as it's unfolding.
mm,
And so it's really about how can we develop a greater meta awareness to be able to recognize and understand why we have an urge to go to social media or read the news or do web surfing. When we understand the reasons for these urges, then we can take action and we can form a plan and we can become more intentional about what we're doing. And so, that's what I believe is the key is understanding ourselves and our relationships with tech better.
Is there a relationship there between the meta awareness as well as framing in terms of intent?
Yes, because framing is about the perspective that we use when we make decisions or, such as going to social media or
Hmm.
going to read the news. How are we framing it, right? And you might frame reading the news as a way to take a break, or you might frame it as, oh, I'm just really bored and
Mm,
I want to procrastinate from doing this work. And so I'm going to read the news. These are two different ways of framing it. And meta awareness would be about understanding the framing, understanding the perspective you're using, right? And there's power in understanding why we're doing the things we're doing. A lot of power. And it's really about understanding these kinds of unconscious actions that we do all the time with our devices. You talked about clicking on that notification or even an urge from within ourselves to check something. And it turns out people are as likely to interrupt themselves as to be interrupted by something external, like a notification. So it's really about understanding that, and then we can have more control and more agency in our attention, which essentially is the crux of the book.
Incredible. Gloria, before we break today, where can folks read some of your latest work, some of your latest research, and certainly, your book here, which I recommend everyone read because it's I have it dog-eared at this point and all highlighted out.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that. So I do write a weekly column on Substack about these topics. And in fact, my latest Substack is called How Much Should We Trust ChatGPT to Summarize Information, which
Ooh,
is based on a pretty large experiment. My Substack is gloriamark.substack.com. And so I will, every week I talk about a different topic related to our lives in the digital world in some manner. Yes, you can go to my website, www.gloriamark.com, and you can also find me on LinkedIn and X, formerly Twitter.
fantastic. Gloria, we're going to keep all those in the show notes as well for folks who are listening today. But I really wanted to thank you for your time. This has certainly been a treat.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.